Now time for your hungry crew when you're wondering what you're gonna do. Bring along your wife and son and daughter. Feed them all for $3 1/4. Steak and all the trimmings at Diamond Jim's. The steakhouse where the food is family size.
Your public television station brings you the best in programming. Masterpiece Theater, Evening at Symphony. The best in film, documentary, light entertainment, and education.
Hello, children. This is your Uncle Pip for Silly Putty. Silly Putty is the wonderful toy that stretches and breaks, picks up pretty pictures, bounces and hops and oozes all over the table. So get Silly Putty. It's fun for children. A little boy. That's my Silly Putty, little boy. Come back here, dear little boy. Give that back to me, little boy. Little boy, now you come back here with that Silly Putty. Silly Putty is the toy that everybody can enjoy. Get some Silly Putty.
Hey, I just bought every single one of the fabulous flavor salad dressings from Good Seasons. Flavors with international flair that take you all around the world, like
Italian dressing. It's full of spice. On top you salad. It's so nice.
or Smoky Country Bacon Bits, Hound Dog Knee Slap and Barn Raised Good. Smoky Country Bacon Bits is real, real good. Or try their
French. I love dressing on a salad.
So try all the Good Seasons dressings. It's a fling around the world. And there's Russian, Green Goddess, Thousand Island, Caesar, California Avocado, Sweet and Sour, Rocky Mountain Ranch.
First National Bank of Milwaukee.
63 hours a week for your banking convenience. Log Cabin Maple Syrup starts deep in a cold forest in February. Sugaring off time when we take the good, pure heart out of the maple. Log Cabin brings it direct from the forest to you in our maple syrup. All natural and just as clean and tasty as the day we draw it out of the tree. Log Cabin Maple Syrup. We tend to be proud of it.
If your meals every night are a bit of a fright and your family is bored with your baking, if desserts are a crime, then it might be the time to discover a new undertaking. A Sara Lee treat that's all sugary sweet is the kind of surprise that will sparkle their eyes and make them so grateful they'll beg for a plate full of brownies or cheesecake and tell them to please take another big serving of cream puffs, deserving of praise for the mother who serves them another dessert. From Sara Lee.
Stand as you're able. You may be seated. We welcome you today to this celebration of life for the Reverend Dr. A. Stephen Pieters. I'm Kathy Cooper Ledesma, the senior pastor here at Hollywood United Methodist Church. Before the pandemic, we were honored to host Reverend Pieters and have him join us to tell us about his life in ministry when we do a summer Faith in Film series, and we had him on the Sunday that we were looking at the eyes of Tammy Faye. So it was a joy to honor him then, and it is an honor for us to celebrate his life now. Okay.
Hello, my name's Azariah.
Hi, I'm Daniel.
And I was a caregiver to Steve and became a friend of Steve's, as many of us did.
We are hosts of the podcast Yash Jesus, which Steve was a guest on, and where we met him.
That's right. And if you don't mind indulging me just a little bit, I've always wanted to do a call and response. So if you know it, say it with me. God is good.
God is good.
That's not it. We'll try this again for her. God is good. All the time. That's right.
Oh, okay.
And all the time. And today we're here to celebrate the goodness of God as it manifested in the life of Steve Pieters. So we want to invite up Reverend Elder Jim Mitulski, Reverend Elder Alex Escoto, and Reverend Lucia Chappelle for the invocation.
Good afternoon. I want to bring greetings also from the founder of the Metropolitan Community Churches, Reverend Elder Cecilia Eggleston, who is not able to be here. But I have a letter from her which I'll give to the family afterwards. And we want to say this is United Methodist Church, Hollywood, and it's MCC together. And we're glad to all be here. I'll open in prayer and then turn it to my colleagues. Holy One, Goddess, God, Spirit of life, thank you for bringing us here right now to celebrate Steve Pieters' life and his eternal life. We are so grateful for all the ways that we have known and know him still, because we believe that love is stronger than death. We believe that Steve's spirit and presence is here among us, and that he lives eternally in God's heart and memory, just as he lives in our hearts and in our memories.
Blessed be your name, O God, creator and sustainer. We celebrate the life of Steve, our beloved, and we ask that you cover his family with your wings of love and hope. Give them the courage to stand before us and remember the moments that made Steve, Steve, so that together we can journey celebrating the life that has changed many.
Wonderful spirit, spirit of magic and fairy wands, spirit of tap dancing. Be with us, be around us, help us through this time, and let us know that you are with us and that our friend Stephen is with us. In all the holy names we pray, amen.
We would like to welcome up some of Steve's lifelong friends, Harrison Tripp and Melinda Royce. And we also have Christy Hefner with a pre-recorded message joining them.
Hi, I'm Tripp Royce, and my iPad's not working. So, my assignment was to sort of give some anecdotes about where Steve and I came from. I met him, I think, in 1956. We were both the children of faculty members at a school, and we were neighbors, and we both had older siblings that we were a little bit afraid of, and so we had those things in common, and then that was about it. I was kind of noisy and noisy. That'd do it. Noisy. A little pugnacious, a little spoiled. Steve was very, very quiet, kind of more in his head than I was. And I wrote this little description of his room, which I really wish I had in front of me because I really liked it. But basically, I was playing sports and roughing it up with people, and Steve was in a world of fantasies, and in Tinkerbell and Walt Disney, and a very, very strong kind of inner life. And it just kind of clicked for us. So we were good for each other in a kind of an unexpected way, and we sort of, I went this far and then Steve picked up and went that far, and between the two of us, we actually managed to be pretty whole, I thought. I kind of protected him, and I was a very protective kind of person, and he kind of stretched me, kept me always sort of imagining what things could be. So skip forward, I don't know, we were about 9 or 10 years old, and Steve wanted to do a play, and we had a little posse by then. We had 4 or 5 other kids that we used to hang out with, and he asked me to, of course I was the bad guy, and so so the story goes, the script went, the screenplay went, I shoot this neighborhood girl. And then the next scene, very next scene, I'm bringing her flowers and she forgives me, and that's the end of the play. Steve wrote that up on that, remember the yellow pads with the blue lines? Bill Cosby used to talk about big chunks of wood floating around in them. He wrote that script out. It was about 2 pages long, and he sent it off to Disney. He did. He sent it off to Disney, and about, I don't know, maybe a month later, he got a letter back from Hollywood, California, thanking him very much and rejecting it. I'll bet you $10 that rejection letter is in the basement of the National Gallery, or wherever his stuff is stashed in DC. And then the last sort of really classic story, from my recollection anyway, is when he and I had gone our separate ways. We'd graduated from school, and he'd gone off. I actually don't know where he was at that point. But he came back, and we both happened to be in town at the same time. And this was probably around I'm guessing 73, maybe. And he very seriously invited me to go for a hike And I thought, this is great. I haven't seen him in a long time, so we went for a hike, and he looked at me all somber and said, Trip, I'm gay. Okay, inside my brain, I went, ha ha ha, I knew that. I've known that since we were 8. But I didn't do that. My gut at the time was that it was a really serious thing for him to be telling me that. And so I respected it, and I think I got it right. Up until the late 60s, we didn't have a word for people with his sexual preference that didn't sound like a social disease. We didn't have a word that was positive. And then we didn't have any language for it at all. And so he and I never really talked about it. We both referred to, there were gay men in our community who lived alone, and they were referred to as the bachelors. And he referred to them, you know, this is how we grew up. So that's basically all I've got. After that, he started intermingling with the rest of humanity, and all went well. So, thanks.
I think this is where we're going to queue up our video from Christy Hefner, unless Melinda Royce is here. Oh, okay. So we're going to queue up the video from Christy Hefner.
When Steve and I met, we were kids. I mean, really, 15 years old, at the National Music Camp, where we both were studying Gilbert and Sullivan, musical theater, and chorus. Our biggest worries were, would we get the part, and would we get the boy? The thing about NMC is that some people who go there go on to have extraordinary professional careers as singers, actors, and musicians. But most of us just love to perform and love the chance to study under amazing teachers. But what all of us learned is that we were making lifelong friends and bonds. Steve was able to parlay a voice that was mature beyond his years into studying theater at Northwestern, and so lived in Chicago, where he became not just a deeper friend of mine, but a lifelong friend of my mom's. She would cook dinner for him at a time when, if you're in college, the best you can hope for is a decent sub sandwich. And indeed, when in 1979, she and the wonderful Pierre decided they were going to get married after having lived together, it was Steve that they wanted to officiate. It was his first wedding, and he was very proud of the fact that the marriage was a wonderful one. And in fact, August 26th was their 44th wedding anniversary. And it was the very first year that they didn't receive a card from Steve. When Steve was first diagnosed, I don't have to tell the people here today what that meant at that time. But what I can say with equal parts of respect, love, and awe is that Steve not only faced down death, but leveraged his life of health challenges into having the extraordinary empathy that made him such a compassionate counselor, into being a passionate advocate who inspired others, and into becoming a man of such deep faith that no matter what the challenges, there was a reservoir that he could draw upon. And with all he faced down, how delicious is it that the last years of his life were filled with the joy of The Eyes of Tammy Faye, walking the red carpet with Jessica Chastain, the Elton John musical, and finishing his memoir, which is going to be published next year. He taught us to take nothing, not a single day, for granted. He taught us to not just sing with joy, but to live with joy. And now he's tap dancing with the angels.
Next, the National Music Camp Interlochen Tribute, written and narrated by Donald Cohn, edited by David Meyer.
Some of Steve's happiest and most crucially formative adolescent experiences took place in the late 1960s amidst the pine forests of northern Michigan at the National Music Camp, now part of the Interlochen Center for the Arts. Interlochen is a place where students from across the country and around the globe, kids with an artistic bent, find nurturing and acceptance, and it was the perfect spot for an awkward kid from Andover, Mass, with a terrific singing voice, to develop his talent and begin to find his place in the world. Here, Steve forged some lifelong friendships, both on and off stage. We are some of Steve's friends from his Interlochen days. Since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we've been gathering monthly via Zoom, forging an extended family and support network. Over the years, we've celebrated with Steve through his triumphs and have been part of his extended safety net during the tough times. Even during the depths of his illness, Steve has been there for us, offering a ready ear, concern, and counsel. He was our beloved friend, and we miss him more than words can express. Sometimes the best farewells are said without words. We'd like to offer a brief musical tribute to Steve, written by the American composer Howard Hanson, who dedicated his romantic symphony to a place among the Michigan pines where budding artists are nurtured and educated even today. This theme is played at the conclusion of every performance at Interlochen, where the tradition is for the audience to then depart without further applause. This one's for you, Steve.
Now, Northwestern and McCormick Seminary and MMC, Michael Vode and Carl Schmid for Mar Armand.
Hello. Would you like to go first?
Sure. It's on my cell phone, excuse me for having to pull this out. Hi, Timothy. Thank you. We are. It's an honor to read on behalf of Donna Weddle, Steve McCormick's seminary friend and retired Army chaplain. Donna writes, Steve was a close friend during our 3 years at McCormick Theological Seminary and has been a family friend and colleague in ministry for the past 47 years at the McCormick. Steve taught faculty and students alike with his education and his knowledge of Scripture in the Hebrew and Greek about those passages that had been used against the gay community. He also modeled joy with his great faith and his wonderful pastoral care for all. We stayed connected over the years through normal and rough times in 2 different ministries on many different battlefields. He tried to heal and comfort folks on the AIDS battlefield and as an MCC minister, and I tried to do so as an army chaplain and Presbyterian minister on many other battlefields. But his love of God and joy and singing and dancing will be with me during all of my life.
I want to know who put me behind someone with a beautiful accent like that to speak. I met Steve my freshman year in college at Northwestern doing a production of The Gondoliers by Gilbert and Sullivan. And I was in the chorus, but Steve wore this big white wig and a gold embroidered coat and played the Duke of Plaza Toro. And that's pretty much how he introduced himself on stage every time he said his name. I'm the Duke of Plaza Toro. You've kind of heard that laugh earlier. Anyway, we had a great time doing the show. It was my first show there. Many lifelong friends came from that cast, and Steve and I did other shows together there. And in summer stock, well, I don't know if you can call working at Six Flags amusement parks summer stock. They get it. But we did, and we became lifelong friends. Years later, we both ended up in Los Angeles, and I had just left my partner, well, we had broken up back in Chicago, and I was navigating the gay scene in Los Angeles as a relatively naive kid from a small farm town in the Midwest. So don't judge, but I was kind of overwhelmed by it all. You know, and I confided with Steve. I said, you know, I don't know how to navigate all of this, the drag queens and the leather daddies and the dancing cowboys and stuff. And he said, Michael, just because you're gay doesn't mean you have to be a drag queen or walk around in cowboy hats and chaps. Just be yourself. And then, honestly, I don't remember if this was part of that conversation or if he emailed, well, it may not have been emailed me, sent me a sermon he had given or something he had written. It might have been an essay, but it was right after this conversation. And in it, one line stuck out. He said, as a gay man, if I don't love my drag queen brothers and sisters, who will? And of course, that's very prescient today, but it jumped out at me. And it changed my life, and it changed my attitude, and it opened my mind, and it opened my heart. Breathe. And as I was thinking about this the last couple of months, I realized that's what he did his whole life. He opened people's minds and hearts, whether he was preaching or writing or administering to the sick or talking to evangelicals. And I think, to me, anyway, that will always be a big part of his legacy.
This is from, sorry, I'm pulling up my notes here. Maher said, Steve loved the theater and majored in it as an undergraduate. This is certainly an early part of his legacy. I think there were some images, perhaps, that I suspect he would be pleased to have recognized and won perhaps many of his friends and associates. A note here from a colleague at Northwestern. I came to know Steve through the attempt to preserve at Northwestern University, his alma mater, the archival records of his life. And what an exemplary life Steve led of dedication and ministry. To those who otherwise had known scorn and isolation, Steve offered hope and love. The story of his personal sufferings is well known. His willingness to bend that suffering toward the service of others is inspirational, even saintly, I would agree. Preserving the records of Steve's life will ensure his wonderful example will be known to future generations. Steve will be written into our history indelibly, and as a figure of history, he'll continue to do good. It was a privilege to know Steve, and it is an honor to protect his legacy. Thank you.
I didn't get to see the video from National Music Camp because I didn't have the view, but I heard it and it was beautiful, the tribute. I know how much Steve loved National Music Camp from the salacious stories he told me. My goodness, I want to go. There's many things that Steve loved. National Music Camp being one of them. The tree outside of his front door that bloomed a bright yellow every spring, wind chimes, and fairy wands. So I want to invite Reverend Keith Mazingo, senior pastor, to give us his pre-recorded message.
Good afternoon. I'm Reverend Keith Mazingo, Senior Pastor of Founders Metropolitan Community Church here in Los Angeles. I am so delighted to welcome you here today on behalf of our congregation, where Reverend Steve is my colleague and friend. I first met Reverend Steve Pieters back in the early 90s when I was the minister of music at Founders Metropolitan Community Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. He was the field director for our AIDS ministry in our denomination, and he showed up one Sunday with this wand, waving a wand like he was a fairy. And he preached about hope. And that's what I hope that we will all stay with today, hope. You see, he was the first person any of us had known that lived through AIDS. He was living with it instead of dying with it. And he preached a message of hope. And for many of our congregants, after he left, his message remained, because they kept coming up and they wrote him and they called him, and I found out that this was going on all over the world. He was constantly receiving messages saying, "You're the first person that taught me I did not have to die with AIDS." He brought hope, this message of hope. Fast forward to 2018, I was hired to be the senior pastor here at Founders Metropolitan Community Church. Reverend Steve was already a volunteer staff pastor here. Now he becomes my colleague, and I get to visit with him after all of these years. He's still alive. He's still preaching this message of hope. And he's so thrilled about me being here and me remembering him and all of the messages that came behind him about hope, and how many people he encouraged along the way. And he decided, well, what can I do for my church? Well, let's get you introduced. So he took me to Allison Arngram's radio show, and we got the message of Founders Metropolitan Community Church, the first and oldest gay church, started for and by gay people. Yes, we believe you can have a relationship with the mystery of life. And guess what? We still teach that message. We're still here today, 55 years later. He also took me to meet Reverend Sheena Method, LA radio. We did show after show. We did her Raising the Vibration show. And it was through Reverend Steve that we were able to once again revive the message of Founders Metropolitan Community Church. So I thank you, Allison. I thank you, Sheena, for making that happen. And guess what? Even from that, Reverend Sheena is now a volunteer, well, not volunteer, she's a staff pastor here at Founders MCC, leading our monthly interfaith service called Saturday Night Spiritual. I hope you will join us sometime. So Reverend Steve, we honor you today. We bless you. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for all that you've done for all of these years. Thank you that even today, we carry with us that same message of hope. We love you. We miss you. We'll see you again.
Thank you. Oh, no. One of the reasons we loved having Steve on our podcast, Yes, Jesus, is he had so much to say and so much to do. He's left us with so many memories and words, and apparently a few salacious stories I need to hear on the car ride home. But here's a message from Steve. I Can Still Dance from Outwards, courtesy of Mason Funk Executive Director. Here's Reverend Steve Pieters.
Religion was an important part of my family's life. My grandparents were Presbyterian missionaries to Korea, and my uncle was a very well-known Presbyterian pastor. Dad was a deacon, and Mom was, chairman of the Christian Education Committee. So we were in church every Sunday, that's for sure. I started getting sick in 1982 with what we now know as AIDS, but was then called GRID. I went through a long period of severe illness. In April of 1984, I was diagnosed with stage 4 lymphoma, Kaposi sarcoma, and full-blown AIDS. And I was given 8 months to live by one health professional. I felt very abandoned by God through that period of severe illness in 1982 and 83. I just thought, how could God let this happen to me? My pastor, Ken Martin, he invited me to preach the Easter sermon 2 weeks later. And I said, "No, you mean Good Friday, don't you? I'm dying." And he said, "No, you need to preach Easter." And it was one of the most valuable gifts anybody could have given me, or anybody has given me, to really look at what it meant to believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ as a person who was facing a certain ugly, stigmatized death. And what I discovered was that if God is greater than the death of Jesus on the cross, as I believe, then God is greater than AIDS. And I said that in front of the congregation, and the congregation gasped. Like, how could you, oh, God? Oh, yeah, oh, of course. People, you could see people, light bulbs going off all over the congregation. And I said, if God is greater than AIDS, then I can face death from this horrible disease. And even though they told me the worst thing they could possibly tell me, I can still enjoy my friends. I can still laugh. I can still dance. When I said I can still dance, I did a little shuffle off to Buffalo across the altar, and the congregation roared their approval. So I don't know what awaits me tomorrow. I don't know what awaits you tomorrow, but all either of us have is right now, this moment. And in this moment, I choose to feel alive and at peace and grateful and hopeful.
God is greater than AIDS. I hear Steve say that, and I hear him say, I don't know how God allowed this to happen to me, but boy, look at what you did with it, right? How many people you've changed. I'd like to welcome up some of Steve's friends from APLA, the meanest little girl next to the little house on the prairie, Allison, and Bob Schoonover, please.
Okay, no, I don't know what I'm going to do without Steve Pieters. He's gotten me through a lot of really weird stuff over the last 37 years. We talked about life, we talked about death, we talked about God. Yes, Bob Schoonover, director of the Southern California AIDS Hotline, and I did meet Steve at APLA, but that was just the beginning. He became a part of our lives. He performed our marriage. He was part of us. He was part of our family. He was part of who we were. His influence on my life goes a lot deeper than most of you know. Now, as he said, you all know who I am and what show I was on. And many of you know that I go on these tours all over the country to all these prairie places, etc. How did that start? Well, the first time I went to Walnut Grove, Minnesota was not because of Laura Ingalls or her resulting television show. I went to Walnut Grove, Minnesota because Steve Pieters booked me to speak at All God's Children MCC in Minneapolis for a fundraiser for their new AIDS hospice. Part of the fundraiser was the Bringing Nellie Home picnic, an event in the real Walnut Grove, population 600, where the mayor had given us permission for me to do an AIDS lecture in the middle of the town square. And shortly after that, I did get a letter that the 4-H Club of Walnut Grove had started a project making quilts for babies with AIDS that they were sending out all over the world. So as you know, for the last 30-odd years, I've been on a veritable prairie circuit, and it is because of Steve Pieters. There's many people here. We're going Oklahoma next weekend. Who's going to Oklahoma? Yes, going to Oklahoma next weekend. You may thank Steve Pieters, and you may thank MCC. That is how this started. Now, his new book, as you know, comes out in the spring. Love is Greater Than AIDS. I'm in it. Yes, buy it. Thank you. You can pre-order. But I'm going to give you a couple of quotes from his old book because I think he wants you to know these things. Things Steve wanted you to know. The Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Church has been the living body of Christ for me. The gay community is where I want to be. It is where I've experienced the greatest love. It is where I have found God. I am learning that when I ask God to remove the pain, sometimes the answer is, take it away, I just gave it to you. As a fool for Christ, I can face death and still do a tap dance. But, page 35, I found out he was wrong. He's wrong on page 35. He said something wrong, and I caught him. He said, I will probably never have a second career in the movies. I will probably never live in a fabulous house in the hills. I will never have a big screen stereo TV. Ha! Beautiful house in Atwater Village, giant big screen TV, and because of Eyes of Tammy Faye, he walked the red carpet from here to New York City and went to the Oscar luncheon with Jessica Chastain. In your face! And if Steve was here, he would say, you see, but that is just God showing you that it's never too late to realize your dreams and accomplish the things that you were put on earth here to do. Oh, fine, be right again. But he also said, believing in the resurrection of Jesus Christ means that even in facing my death, I can experience hope and joy and peace because God is greater than AIDS. And he was right about that.
All right, we are going to bring up the 1980s FMCC Founders Metropolitan Community Church, Reverend Lucia Chappelle and Reverend Nancy Ratcliffe.
He was kind of sick of where he was living. He was in Hartford, Connecticut. I'm one of the people that convinced him to move to Los Angeles, thereby creating the true Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. For the first couple of years, then one of the miracles, you never find this in Los Angeles, somebody moved out of a cottage in my courtyard. This never happens. Nobody ever moves. If you get one of those places, you never move. Somebody moved, so I could move Stephen into the courtyard right across from me. So when people say that I was one of the people who took care of Stephen, I always kind of find that funny because I didn't feel like I was taking care of him. I thought we were just hanging out. We hung out and we watched movies and we watched MASH every night. Before bed, we had to watch MASH. When MASH was taking off the air at 11:30, we couldn't sleep for 3 weeks. We hung out, we laughed. Oh, how we laughed. All the time, just rolling laughing. When he got the call about Tammy Faye, oh my, you have no idea how hard we laughed then. Oh my gosh, we killed ourselves laughing. But long before that, when Stephen first started getting sick, one of the things that he came down with was this dreadful fungus on his foot. I mean, it was just, I won't even describe it because it was ugly and nasty. Blech. And he needed something to soak his foot in this bizarre potion they had given him to soak his foot in. So I went and I dug around in the house and I found my grandmother's roasting pan. Now this is a very special thing. I don't have very many things from my grandmother, but I had her roasting pan. So I brought it over to the house and we filled it up with this blech stuff, and he started soaking his foot in. Now, I don't know what this mess was, but it ate the finish on my grandmother's roasting pan. It now has lesions on the bottom. But you know what? You can still cook with it. And that's something I learned from Stephen. You know, you might have lesions, outside or inside, but you can still cook. You can still make a difference. You can still nourish people. You can still loan your grandmother's roasting pan to a friend in need. Not many months after that, when Steve got his big diagnosis, the lymphoma diagnosis, I wasn't home, I was at work, and he called me as soon as I got home to come right over, and I came over to find out the news, and another friend of ours was there, someone who had taken on the job of being chaplain to the clergy in MCC. Nobody asked her to do it. Nobody hired her to do it. She created a department. Spiritual life and clergy care, SLAC. We used to say it was for all us slackers. But she took on that job and she stayed with Steve. She stayed overnight with Stephen that night. She drove him to the Tammy Faye interview and to many other appointments and whatnot that he had. She was really in our corner all the time. That person is the Reverend Nancy Radcliffe, and you're going to hear from her now.
Hi, I'm the Reverend Nancy Radcliffe, and I'm here to share some of my memories of the Reverend Steve Pieters. 40 years ago, I arrived at Steve's house to give him a ride to the hospital for an appointment with Dr. Levine. This was the first of many weekly trips that became a ritual for us over the next couple of years, then on and off for the next 38 years. Disneyland, Halifax, many visits to the farm in New Hampshire. These were sometimes just us being friends, and others times of me being chaplain and caregiver. This man, who was supposed to die in less than a year, became an active pastor to pastors with AIDS, joined the Gay Men's Chorus, and much more. Now in his early 70s, he was still going to live forever, especially in our minds and hearts. Then everything came to a screeching halt. Steve was diagnosed, not with AIDS, he really did beat that one, but with 4 cancers. This announcement was so alarming to me that I could never remember the details. My son Elijah Radcliffe Neely had died of multiple cancers a year earlier, and I was still in grief over his death. Now I had to figure out how to be present for Steve. 11 months of almost nightly calls to pray with him and to support him. Prayers for healing, prayers that a publisher would pick up his book. Yay, this one worked. Then came the realization that this time it would end differently. The direction of my prayers changed to, dear God, we trust in the future you have for Steve. We know it is beyond anything that we can imagine or hope for him. Things we haven't even dreamed of dreaming about. The promise of a future that will be his. Steve fully puts himself into your care. We pray all of this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Steve, my heart believes that you're in this future with God. My head still struggles.
Slight disclaimer, we don't recommend cooking turkeys in your foot bath bowl. I'm just saying. No, because I saw on the internet some people, when they get sick, they use the same bowl for popcorn. I don't know, you guys do what you want to do. I just would like to point out Azariah Southworth's earrings, which he made, which are exact replicas of Tammy Faye's earrings that she wore when she was on the RuPaul show. So, just big ups to my bestie.
These little things, you know, something for Steve today. But it takes a village to get us to where we need to go. As a caregiver for Steve, I really got to witness the village that really uplifted Steve and kept him. And I love that today that this village is together and reflecting that light of Steve. They're not part of the village. But I want to invite up someone who was pivotal in Steve's village and taking care of him, and that is the Dr. Alexandra Levine.
Reverend Kathy and Reverend Jim, and Lashana Tova to everyone. Happy New Year to you. And Michael Feinstein, you can join us if you like.
This is the village. Azariah was supposed to pick Steve up. Steve called me every morning at 7 a.m. from the moment of that diagnosis about a year ago. And I knew he was in trouble. I said, as soon as somebody gets there to take you into the hospital, into City of Hope, let me know and I'll call them and tell them to expect you. And it was Azariah who was the person to be there. Steve called, said, yes, Azariah's here. I've got my shoes on. I'm ready to go. I said, great. I hung up, called City of Hope right away. And the next thing I knew, about a half hour later, it was Azariah who had seen Steve collapse there when he started to walk and called 911, and that led to the rest. I first met Steve in 1983. I was 38 years old at that time, and Steve was 30. I was an assistant professor of medicine at USC and had just started reading about these unusual infections and cancers in gay men. Steve had developed fatigue, big lymph glands, purple blotches on his feet, and he came into LA County USC Medical Center, I was asked to see him. I was never the doctor who said, "You don't have any time to live," by the way. The lymph nodes turned out to be malignant lymphoma, and the blotches turned out to be Kaposi sarcoma. The underlying problem was AIDS, and Steve was my very first patient from what would eventually be thousands of others who had it, nameless at that point, eventually called GRID, and then finally called AIDS. Steve was frightened that he was dying of this unknown disease with no treatment. I explained that I knew we would find the answers, we would eventually know how to treat, and I needed Steve to keep his head together, his mind together, knowing that I was not asking him to eke out an entire lifetime on his own, but we would work together, and it would be only a few years until our answers were known. We developed a system of taking care, exercise, but listening to his body carefully and resting when he needed to, eating properly, laughter, friendship, village, involvement in life. I eventually started Steve on the first experimental drug for AIDS, Suramin. It was a trial funded by the National Cancer Institute, NCI. He was patient number 1 on that national trial. 2 months later, both cancers had disappeared and never again came back. When asked to give a major lecture to the scientists and physicians at City of Hope at NCI at that time, I made a slide that recounted why I thought Suramin had worked for Steve and not for others. The first possibility was that Steve was patient number 1 on that trial, and the first patient always seems to do very well in these experimental protocols. No one laughed as they thought they might, having experienced that kind of thing in the past. The second possibility was that there was a God, because Steve's first dose was given on Good Friday. He was an ordained minister, and that's why he thought it was successful. Again, no one laughed. The third possibility was that Suramin actually worked. It was only then that the audience finally chuckled. 4 months later, Steve was admitted to the county hospital without a blood pressure, in shock, due to the Suramin that had now caused his adrenal glands to fail. The trial was stopped and the drug was discarded. Even though it had worked, it was just too toxic. But even though the drug ultimately failed, the Suramin experience shows us that Steve was very much a part of the decades-long search for those answers. What was the cause of AIDS? Where did it come from? How to treat it? How to prevent? He was willing to take the risks of joining those early experimental trials for himself, but really for everyone else who was going to come behind him. And those trials eventually, by 1996, allowed us to bring really meaningful help to thousands and thousands of people all over the world. In time, Steve developed other illnesses, from shingles to pneumonia to hemorrhagic pancreatitis and eventually on to cancer of the esophagus and stomach, metastatic to the liver at the time of his first symptom of difficulty in swallowing, occurring 40 years after that first diagnosis of AIDS. Throughout it all, Steve became a beacon of hope to others who looked to him as the symbol of possibility, the defeat of despair, and ultimately of life given, even though thoroughly unexpected. And he also became a teacher of sorts to the clients and colleagues and friends that he taught and inspired, and to my medical students as well, as I asked him to join me in the only lecture to first-year medical students at USC that is mandated for in-person attendance. I call it Medicine, the Power of the Art, a 2-hour lecture in which I present scientific data proving the importance and power of the relationship between mind and body. And then I invite Steve to come up and talk for the second hour about his experiences with all of us doctors and nurses, teaching the students what it's like to be a patient and what they can do to help their patients of the future. At the end, Steve would sing the song that he modified from Pirates of Penzance, and the students would go crazy, jumping up, clapping, shouting out to him, throwing their arms around him, just as all of his audiences seemed to do over all of these years and all of those decades. Steve spent his lifetime in making remarkable friendships with all of us here, I would imagine, and so many others as well. He nourished those friendships, and his friends in turn nourished him up until the very end. This village was beyond anything I have ever seen in over 50 years of being a physician. He knew what it meant to cherish others and to be cherished in return. We've all lost someone special here, and to me, not just a patient who taught me as well as my students, but as a dear friend who attended our family Thanksgiving dinners for years and went to lunch with my cousins when I was away at work and couldn't be there. Ultimately, all of us here and countless others were incredibly fortunate to have known Steve and to have loved him. May his legacy live on well beyond us. And to all of his Jewish friends out there, I wish you Lashana Tova on this first day of Rosh Hashanah.
You know, I'm Timothy Smith, and in my mind, because it was so common for I was one of many caregivers for Steve Pieters. And actually at this moment, if there are other caregivers, there are about a dozen caregivers, if you would stand up, they're in the audience, Pam, Roylance, and Charlotte, and Todd, and anyone who was a caregiver for Steve Pieters, please stand up and give them a round of applause. Thank you, Todd. Their names are all listed, and Carl and Michael, people who only met him maybe within the last year or two or three, also stepped up. Meditations, maybe you'll talk about it. I don't want to steal Michael's thunder here, but Carl Schmidt would take him on walks. Lou Spisto would bring him groceries, the executive director of GMCLA, and everybody showed up, and we didn't always ever meet each other. Some of us are meeting for the first time tonight. So when you say hello to them, thank them for their service. I also wanted to say, you know, in AIDS conversations, there's an overlooked population, and that would be what I call AIDS orphans. There's certainly orphans who've lost their parents to AIDS, but there's another population whose parents are around, but whose time, their parents' time has been consumed by taking care of friends or other people with AIDS. And my son, who is here with his girlfriend, Allison, I would say he's an AIDS orphan, because many, many times I would have to say, I have to go take care of Steve, or I have to go take care of Michael, or I have to go take care of Ronnie, or I have to go take care of Andre or something or else. So he lost a lot of time with me, and I want to thank him for his generosity, because he's still here, and here he is today. Michael's going to speak on behalf of Solomon in a little bit, but I had a little bit of a unique maybe point of view with Steve, because in a conversation with Alexandra, who is a phenomenal doctor, like she called me from Turkey while she was on vacation to say, how's Steve doing at Hollywood Presbyterian, and what are his liver enzymes, and what are these numbers, and I would give her those, and she'd say, that's not possible, you can't be alive with those numbers, and I'd say, but it's Steve Pieters. And amazing. No other doctor I've ever met on the planet like her, and Steve really, really benefited from her. So a deep bow of gratitude to you, Dr. Levine. But in a conversation, we came to an understanding or realization that we were often in Steve's blind spot. We were there at his side, at his back, and he could see what he needed to do. He could see his friends, but he couldn't necessarily see us. And it gave me a perspective of being able to observe and watch, almost like an anthropologist in a way. And sometimes it was rather odd because I would literally be someone helping him, praying for him in the hospital. I think I pinch hitted for Allison once because she got, maybe Bob had COVID and then you were quarantining, so there was a lot of tossing the ball around. And I said, well, I'm the understudy, I'm the swing for Allison and everybody, so I'll take Steve. I prayed for Steve in the hospital. I think he was having an imaging or something done. And on the way home, he started dictating a text to his phone, and he was saying, thank you for being there, thank you for praying for me, thank you for being at my side, thank you for really having, just spending a moment to devote to me and my well-being. And I thought, well, I'm right here, I'm driving you home, why don't you just, well, he was, and I said, well, who is that to? And he said, Michael, it's to Michael Feinstein because he's praying for me right now. And I said, wow, that must be really, really special and wonderful. And he might talk about that. But those moments when people showed up for Steve, when people showed up in the hospital, when they called him on the phone, especially in the last 17 days where he was hospitalized, when he saw, I think if you followed on Caring Bridge, we were so encouraged when he woke up and he said, water, phone, Azariah, he was always asking for Azariah, who, by the way, his service was cleaning the cat litter and taking out the recycling. I mean, everybody showed up in every kind of way. And then Steve's first sentence was, am I on TV? And Solomon, who is not here, but unfortunately is ill, said, well, yes, as a matter of fact, the nurses were laughing, everybody was laughing. He said, you're on TV in about 2 hours. Lily Tomlin's gonna introduce you on the Project Angel Food fundraiser. So, and he lit up. Those visits, those phone calls, people who called to sing to him, people who called to pray, people, just anything like that. We could see on the monitors, we could see his blood pressure getting stronger. We could see his oxygen levels getting stronger. We could see visibly on the monitors him getting better. And he understood and reached for that. And that was part of his regimen of creating the circumstances for wellness and for healing. And all of you were as good as any medication or prescription that Steve was ever given, or treatment, or radiation, or chemo, or anything like that. So a deep bow to all of you, because you helped keep him alive. And I could talk for hours, but I'm going to spare you and introduce you to Michael Feinstein, who I've known since I think I was 22 and you were 20. And by the way, the only reason I know Steve is because 20 years before I met him, I was understudying a dancer in Chorus Line on Broadway. And 20 years later, that person who was a Christian, a closeted gay Christian, he wasn't closeted as a gay man, he was closeted as a Christian. I didn't know that. He was dating Steve. And then that gentleman and I were doing Candide at the Amundsen, and he said, since I'd had a bad time with my first boyfriend, he was a batterer, I went way the other way and tried conversion therapy willingly. That was a nightmare. That was really damaging. So I was seeking pastoral counseling from Steve. He was looking for a boyfriend. He was always looking for a boyfriend. So, and I said, I think if we're friends, it will last. And it did. So that's how I knew Steve. And then there were so many intersections like that. And then Steve met Michael. And I thought, well, this is a very interesting circle complete. But Michael's here to speak on behalf of Solomon. And I didn't mean to get you up here and exhaust you. I just wanted to visual images of a village and a community around Steve. Good to see you.
What would Steve have done without Timothy? Steve and I knew each other for only 13 months, but it felt like forever. And I feel like he was my caregiver in the time that I knew him. He taught me so much, and no matter what he was feeling, he made everyone around him feel good, but you know that. I just wanted to share a few things he texted to me before reading Solomon's eloquent remembrances. From an event that we were both at, he wrote, "Michael, it was pure delight to spend time with you last evening. It meant so much to me when in the midst of my prayer, we caught each other's eyes. Your smile gave me a smile, and it made the rest of my prayer so much better. Thank you, dear friend." Isn't that sweet? He also could make me laugh with his text. He said, "Good morning, my dear sweet friend. Have a wonderful Sunday. Do you watch the Tony Awards? It's High Holy Day in my house." But most of all, the inspiration in the midst of his illness. He wrote, "Michael, my dear friend, I've been focusing a lot on gratitude this past week, making daily gratitude lists, which include you and our friendship, of course. Please know that I think of you with such love, and feeling your love, even when we don't chat or text anything, is healing. My faith is strong when I remember our healing sessions and your amazing eyes looking in mine. That is getting me through all this craziness and these physical challenges. Sleep well, my friend." So it is in Steve's eyes, when I visualize them, that I will always see and feel him, his acceptance, his faith. And I think that we're all going to be getting a lot of messages from Steve for the rest of our lives and beyond. Here is what wonderful Solomon Traeger wrote. "Courage is the transcendence of fear, and heroism is the transcendence of humanness. Steve's Steveness is that he found a way to transcend the difficult hand he was dealt. He could have sat back into his depression, fear, and self-pity and become small and bitter, but that is not what he did. He had pirates to fight. He refused to be one of the starving bastards at the banquet of life. He was a great teacher to me over time in many ways. Steve actively and intentionally built a universe and a narrative from a small apartment and a hospital bed. How did he do it? He gathered families, beloved blood relatives, Interlochen friends, Northwestern alumni, MCC sisters and brothers, medical folks, activism colleagues, APLA builders, GMCLA brothers, trudgers of recovery, and others equally dear to him. It was a Ponzi scheme of love. What was his magic? Loving each of us with specific attention. When you were in Steve's field of vision, he genuinely focused on you and loved you. His ministry of presence. It's a tool you can use if you master it. It is Steve's legacy. Steve and I discussed recovery from addiction 5 to 7 days a week for 20 years. His growth and willingness were a great lesson to me, and his kind attitude towards my limitations and inspiration. Steve died 23 years continuously sober and smoke-free. The rest, as we say, is icing on the cake. And what icing! We all celebrate the red carpets, the talented friends, and his soon-to-be-published memoir. Here are 2 stories, moments really, that will not make it into the memoir because they happened during his last stay at the hospital. I would like to share them because they really belong to everyone. First, Steve laying peacefully unresponsive in his hospital bed with monitors beeping and machines humming in the background. Beloved Timothy sings to Steve the song, "Angels on Your Pillow." I had not heard that song for many years since I played Michael Feinstein's version over and over for my young son, Jack. Timothy's rendition and the lyrics and its powerful evocation of the great joy it represented in my life overwhelmed me. Now I am down with COVID, and here is Michael closing some cosmic loop. And shortly thereafter, Steve in his last hours among us Several of us from his various families had the good fortune to be there physically, and some were there virtually, on telephones placed around his head, angels on his pillow. There was an extraordinary attention and love focused on Steve, mirroring the love and attention he had focused on us, and the most transcendental, communal, universal spirit as he passed. Now, when in my mind I watch the memory movie of that passing, the two vignettes merge, and I am in that hospital room as Steve is transitioning, suspended in love, and the experience is underscored by the music of Angels on Your Pillow. Sometimes I think this seems a little sappy, but then I remember who I'm remembering. Steve never shied away from sappy. He writes, "My friend Steve was not perfect. He was just a hero. Steve, I wish you love beginning without end, and angels on your pillow."
And now, Amazing Grace, to the tune of Water is Wide. Timothy Smith, soloist on the first verse. We'd like to ask the congregation to join in on the second verse with FMCC pianist Peter Kirkpatrick and HUMC organist John West. Thank you.
Daniel. And thank you. If you'd all join on the second part of it, I think it'll be obvious when to come in. I want to especially thank Steve's niece and nephew, and his cousins Stacy and John and Peyton, Jen and Stephen, because if anyone has been demonstrating grace, I've gotten a lot of grace from you, and I really am grateful for that. It was not always easy to be your uncle's caregiver. He always invited us into difficult spaces, uncomfortable spaces, and we learned a lot. I learned a lot about myself. And this is for Steve.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. I once was blind, but now I see. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining
day that Steve passed, I missed a call from Timothy. I was at the hospital earlier that day visiting with Steve, and I left, and shortly after received a call from Tim, and I missed it, and called him back, and he was singing with that gorgeous voice. And in my spirit, I just knew. I believed that what happened all the other times was going to happen again, that the wisdom in Steve's cells would come through and he would come through. But once I heard Tim's beautiful voice, I knew that we were walking him home. And by the way, he did describe you as a Broadway star. Okay, that's what he told me about you. But I want to invite the family, as well as new and old friends, to come up. The niece and nephew-in-law, Jen Pieters and Stephen, and cousins Stacy, John, and Peyton Zolk. And the Reverend Jay Baker.
Timothy, I'll forgive you for many, many things. I may not forgive you for making me speak right now, after that. So, please bear with me. I'm a little shaky. So I'm Steve's niece, I'm Jen. Steve's older brother, Rick, is my dad. And I think that Tripp and Steve may be the only people who have ever been afraid of my dad. So that's sort of a new one for me. But I think I might be the only one in this room to be able to say that I have known Steve for my entire life. Steve adored and was incredibly close to many, many of his biological family members, counting several of us of his dearest friends, and also very, very close to his in-laws that he kept very, very close as well. Steve was born in Lawrence, Massachusetts, the second son of Dick and Norma Pieters. He spent much of his childhood at Phillips Academy and his summers at the family farmhouse in Andover, New Hampshire, where he would return nearly every summer for a vacation. Last summer, he was there triumphantly after a 3-year COVID hiatus. And the last time I saw him, on July 3rd, in the ICU, he was still plotting his vacation this year in August. We really thought that we would be there. Steve would often say that growing up, his mother was his best friend. Tripp. It was Grandma. She was his confidant. She listened to him sing. She encouraged all of his theater dreams, including Peter Pan and said plays. Sadly, she could never teach him how to cook. Their adult relationship was not always as easy. My grandmother was not an easy woman in the end of her life, but Steve adored her, and he managed to visit her frequently, and he was devastated when she passed. Up until this very spring, he would post annual beautiful social media tributes on her birthday in May. If grandmother was Steve's confidant, my grandfather was his hero. Grandfather installed in both of his sons a deep religious faith, which was the family legacy, an appreciation for academic study, and a love of travel, born of multiple trips in the car across the country back and forth to visit family, a summer in Africa, and a trip around the world when Steve was about 12. When we go out to the reception, y'all can look for the photograph of Steve and his father at the Acropolis in Athens. It's not to be missed. Both Grandpa and Grandma would write to Steve weekly. It was always typewritten, and we found boxes and boxes of letters all neatly stacked. Well, we found letters in every box, basically, but Steve kept masses of their letters. Young Steve was always told that he looked like his mother, and my dad looked like his father. But as he aged, that changed. Steve grew into that oh-so-resilient body, lost his hair, and When I would tell him he reminded me of the grandfather that I remembered, he would just beam with delight. The love and acceptance that my grandfather showed to Steve when he came out, and again when he was diagnosed, was so meaningful to Steve, perhaps more so than anyone else. And you may remember that line in the Tammy Faye interview where he talks about his parents and his coming out. Just a few weeks ago at Steve's choice, we interred most of Steve's ashes in Andover at the Garth burial. He now rests in peace with my grandparents. Steve made a great effort to found friendships and long-term relationships with his cousins across the country, even when it wasn't easy or convenient. Visits, phone calls, texts. Social media made it a little bit easier. I have nary a cat nor food photo that didn't have a heart or a comment. He kept his in-laws as close as his blood relations and took a childlike glee in their adventures. You can ask John Zulk about their trip under the Golden Gate Bridge, or my own husband Stephen about their chocolate safari later. Steve made it a priority to pay visits. Me in Paris, to our maternal cousins Zetta, Karen, and Sherry, to his older cousins / surrogate parents Lucia and Lori, to our paternal cousins David, Rick, Mary Ann, and Pat. Stacy, our grandfathers were brothers, is going to tell you a little bit about their relationship, but I would like to take this moment to share brief letters from cousins Rick and David. First, from cousin Rick in Ohio. It is still hard to believe that Steve is physically no longer with us. It seemed there was nothing, no illness or hardship that he couldn't bounce back from, and he had plenty. I've known Steve from his whole life, mostly from a distance, as he lived in Massachusetts and I in California, but I remember visits from when he was a kid. Steve grew into his strong baritone voice and landed on many stages early and for most of his life. Steve and I really began the closeness of our relationship when he visited in Ohio sometime in the early 60s. When Steve came, the time was all about Steve and I getting to know each other. Neither of us was yet out, but in our closets, we were both devotees of musical theater, so you know where that conversation went. Steve remembered and remarked many times later how I dragged him upstairs and played for him the original Broadway recording of Peter Pan with Mary Martin and Cyril Richard. Anyone who knew Steve knew his love for that show ever after. But we shared that love together, and we both loved Carousel as Rodgers and Hammerstein's best show. He came back to Ohio a few years ago to see another friend in a Sondheim show. Even Gilbert and Sullivan did not get past him. He rewrote the lyrics to one of their tunes, which he shared with the Los Angeles Gay Men's Chorus, that wonderful group of earthbound angels who did so much for him. When Steve called and told me of his AIDS diagnosis, when it was still being called GRID, I told him to try not to be the illness, but to be the light that would carry him through. I'm not sure that I didn't still think, as most did at the time, that it was a death sentence. I probably did, as friends were dying all around us. But Steve prevailed. He came to that door several times, and each time he said, "Nope, not yet. I still have more to do." And he did. Steve and I chatted often by messenger or by phone. As I wrote in his Carrying Bridge journal upon his passing, our chats will now be silent. But I know that Steve left this stage at a good time for him. We will miss his light, his faith, his voice, and his humor. But like a musical he would have loved, his life ended on a beautiful note, a big chorus number, leaving all of us, his audience, with tears, full hearts, and souls singing his song. Rick's brother David sent this remembrance. Each of us knew my cousin Steve in our own unique way. I knew him as a story of friendship and trust that evolved over the decades. Steve was 7 years younger than I, and at first, just as a cousin, we didn't know each other very well. large parts of our lives were in fact unknown to one another. After his AIDS diagnosis, it all changed. He came to California and stayed for a few days, as he would do many times over the years. That first time, we talked for hours about life and death, about faith, about what might be unfolding for Steve. It was to be the first of many talks when we grew to know each other and share many inner thoughts and hopes and wonderments. We respected one another and discussed things that weren't easy. We grew in our friendships and taught one another along the way. We shared a deep, strong belief in and relationship with the Christ. We talked of things deep within our souls, and even at one point when I told Steve of my journey into Buddhist practice, there was no judgment, just exploration. We counted on one another and relied on our friendship. Steve was such a giver to me, to my wife Nancy, to countless friends, and to others. At the end, or nearly the end, when he could no longer talk, even though I was 900 miles away in Santa Fe, I felt so strongly that he was in peace. A deep, abiding peace in his eyes and his soul as he left this life and moved on in his journey. I am so thankful he came to be a friend in my life as well as family. Farewell for now, Steve. If I was to define my own relationship with Steve in one word, I'm going to use the word fun. Yes, fun. We always had fun together. It was our priority, and our adventures provided us with so much joy. Despite the fact that we lived thousands of miles apart, we stayed close throughout my childhood, and it was usually in a trip to see my grandparents, either in Arizona or up at the farm in New Hampshire, where my grandfather would cook pancakes that Steve and I had picked the blueberries for, and we would swim in the lake together. I was 8, maybe 7, when I was told that Steve was going to die, the first of many times. We were sat at the kitchen table in Sun City, Arizona, my grandparents' house. It's one of those retirement villages with golf courses and pools, no farther than a mile away. So there we were, and this news was delivered, seriously, and I was familiar with death, but I was, 7 or 8, so I took it in apparently very calmly and said, okay, can we go play now? And so we did, and Steve picked me up and he tossed me up on his shoulders and he'd swing me around and spin me around, and there's lots of pictures of that. And so it was a wonderful and typical afternoon with Steve. There was another one of those Arizona visits where Steve arranged to take all of us to see a Rodgers and Hammerstein's play. It may have been Carousel. Steve loved it, and I was less than impressed. Steve was horrified. We did fare much, much better many years later at Kinky Boots on Broadway. I had talked Steve into making a trip back to New York for a big birthday, and he sang "When I'm 64" for the whole weekend. When I was around 11, Steve took me to Universal Studios. We rode all of the rides and took pictures with King Kong. Some 38 years later, my husband and I returned the favor. We took Steve to Disneyland. We rode all the rides and took pictures with the Cheshire Cat. Steve pointed out the finest restaurant in the park, and that is one regret that I carry, is that I never had the pleasure and great joy of being able to take Steve to the finest restaurant at Disneyland. When I was in college, he came to Paris to visit me during my junior year abroad. We took more pictures all over the city. Jen and Steve and the tulips at the Tuileries, Jen and Steve and the tulips at Saint-Germain, Jen and Steve and the tulips at Montmartre. We picnicked at Versailles. I made him a dinner for my friends. He found the time to have a passionate fling with a young man he met walking by the Seine. We all went to see the VO version of Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet. Ludo and I loved it. Steve was less than impressed. We were horrified. In my 30s, I took to making regular trips from Boston to LA, But our best visits were always those summer visits to the farm, times just so to coincide with August 2nd. Walks around the farm, seeing shows at the barn playhouse, making my grandmother's signature potato salad for our lobster dinners. This was the only thing that Steve could cook, the only thing. And he did have a perfect palate for it. More onion, more cheese, always more cheese. At night, we would sit on the front porch and Steve would tell stories of his youth and his young adulthood. The road trip where my dad's braces picked up a radio signal was a favorite story and always made Steve laugh. He'd tell me stories about his close friendship with my birth mother as well, like the time they had a blast making tuna salad and putting everything under the sun to it. Pickles, olives, mustard, green peppers, capers. Apparently by the time they were done, it was utterly inedible and had to be thrown out after one bite. I'm sorry, Lucia, the man couldn't cook. There's a photo of Steve at the farm wearing that blue gay uncle t-shirt. He loved that shirt, and it's one of my favorite photos. Although I am his only blood niece, I know that he relished filling the role of gay uncle for some of you out there, friends from the chorus, from the church, to Peyton, my cousin Emmy, who could not be here. So I share that memory of Steve in the gay uncle t-shirt with you, and I hope that you remember your Gunkle Steve with as much love as I do. I'll end with a short poem from the 13th century poet Hafiz, more of a prayer really, sent over by David as one of Steve's favorites. I am a hole in a flute that the Christ's breath moves through. Listen to this music. Thank you.
Hello there, I'm Stacy. I'm Steve's cousin, and this is Peyton, Steve's cousin. And I Googled, what is it, second cousin once removed, X, Y, or Z, and they just said, just call it cousin, because that is actually family, and that's what Steve was to all of us. My husband's, Stephen, we'll hear from Barbara later. When Steve got diagnosed, you know, we all know and are so grateful for Timothy and the key role he played in supporting Steve years beyond even that diagnosis. And given that Jen and Stephen were in Boston, we're in San Francisco, Timothy and Solomon were on the ground, we created this care council where we got on the phone every Sunday at 4 p.m. West Coast time and 7 p.m. East Coast time. And Reverend Nancy Radcliffe also joined that. And it was such a privilege to be part of that, supporting Steve, supporting everyone on the ground, supporting Steve every day. And I'm really grateful for that time. Sometimes we were calling in from a sailboat. And I know Jen referenced the story of Steve. Before we get into our plan remarks, that story about Steve wanting to go to the Golden Gate Bridge on a sailboat. He was like, yeah, let's go to the Golden Gate Bridge, let's go, let's go. Well, the tides in the San Francisco Bay are pretty tricky, and they were going out of the Golden Gate at that point. But my husband, to just like fulfill this wish of Steve, we went out there with our boat, and at one point we look at each other and we're like, we better start the motor, because we were not making ground out of back into the bay, but we were kind of making ground out to the Pacific Ocean. But we survived that and celebrated with yummy crab on Fisherman's Wharf, which Steve had his bib and it was all messy and he was loving that. So I invited Peyton to join me here, because about a year ago, Peyton's a sophomore in college now. She was a senior in high school, and she was in journalism. And she had this idea to do an article on Cousin Steve. Do you think he would let me interview him? And what do you all think he said? Yes. And so he was enthusiastically made himself available. And he also actually recruited Dr. Levine, who kindly also participated in the interview. And the article that Peyton wrote for her program was AIDS Survivor and Activist Preaches Against Prejudice, dated October 25th, 2021. And we thought it might be fitting to share a couple of the quotes that Steve gave to Peyton and went out to her whole young community, her high school community and beyond, because it was a program that was nationally acclaimed. So the first was, and some of this we've heard, but he talked a lot about activism and trying to instill those messages for these young people. And so he said, if you want to create hope, you need to take action. Action equals life. Silence equals death. So it was important for me to take action if I wanted to survive. And we've heard multiple times already about his faith and how he really attributes his faith to helping him fight AIDS and all of his life challenges. So I won't repeat that, but he did share with Peyton that God was bigger than AIDS and how he really feels that his faith and his faith community supported him through that journey. And I'm going to pass it to Peyton because he really wanted to tell her what being brave was about.
So when I interviewed Steve, I asked him about what it meant to be brave, and I remember his answer, and it was just very empowering. And he said, "Be brave, be courageous. Remember that courage is just fear with heat. You know, sometimes when you're really scared, you find out that courage is acting on it anyway. So keep going ahead and being brave in doing what is called for. Activism is life, and I think that if you are involved in justice issues now, that will do you well throughout your life." I also asked him what he would tell his younger self, since this article is going to a lot of people who were my age and who are younger, and he said, "I would say to myself, you're going to come out and be proud of being gay, and you won't have to feel that shame you used to feel about being gay. I would tell myself that I was going to face a lot of challenges in life, and I would be able to face those challenges with the friends that all enabled me to face some of the hardest challenges that a person has to face in life. And so I will tell my younger self, don't worry. You're going to get strong and happy, and you're going to have a lot of joy as you move through life, even with all the challenges."
Thank you, Peyton. And then finally, he really emphasized towards the end of the article the importance of nurturing your relationships with family and friends. And so he said, "It is really important for you all to nurture your friendships and your family relationships." And how much have we heard about that today? "I've been close to death, and I realize that the most important thing in life is to love each other, to look at each other in each other's eyes and really see each other for the people that we are and love each other just as we are. I learned a Native American saying that goes like this: the quality of life is not measured by the length of life, but by the fullness with which we enter into each present moment here. Now, none of us have any guarantee about being here tomorrow. All of any of us have is this moment to feel fully alive, feel the joy of love and living, and love your family and love your friends, because you know that's all we have. So be here now, be fully alive." Isn't that our Steve? Thank you.
If you never got to see Tammy Faye cry, you might be able to get to see her son cry live. So, it's almost the next best thing. Everybody loosen up a little bit. Are you guys very Methodist? I didn't know MCC was so tight. It's a memorial, Jay, come on. So I'm gonna give the pastor a little run for his money here. Steve and my mom made history, in 1986? Was it 86? I was 10. And I knew something big was happening. See, after school, my mom did Tammy's house party, and my dad was pretty smart when it came to the idea of, hey, if we have the gay pastor on the show, it should be with Tammy. For a few reasons, but you'll let you read that into that. But he knew that Tammy, funky, silly Tammy Faye could get away with it. Oh, look at Tammy loving the gay man. Isn't that cute? Isn't that adorable? But I remember the buzz around it. I remember the frightening of my parents, not worried about him, but worried about how he would be treated if he came in person. They thought the staff would reject him, they would walk out. And I remember being at 10 years old, knowing that AIDS was terrifying. And sometimes it breaks my heart to we forget what so many folks went through. And me and Steve often talked about reminding these new generation of the pioneers that went before them and the teachers that they have around to take advantage of. I didn't realize that they were about to change the future, nor the future, little did I know that my future was about to be completely changed. That 10-year-old boy saw his mother take a chance and do something she wasn't supposed to do as an evangelical Assemblies of God Christian. And she just said, "Damn it, Jim, we're doing it." For a while, I thought my dad's first name was Damn It. But and lately with me and him, it's kind of been that as well. Damn it, Dad. We're trying. And so I would become an ally in the future. I would be able to build off of my mother's moment with Steve, and his life would continue to keep my mom's life alive. I mean, these two were so interconnected. It's crazy. That's what makes today very hard. It's like a final goodbye. For years, I thought Steve was dead. Now, let me give you an idea how dead I thought Steve was. Okay, this is really crazy. So I come out as an ally, and I lose everything, and the only group that's willing to have me speak at this point is MCC. I mean, I have to lay off the whole staff, everything. My work is gone. And so MCC's like, "Hey, we'll have you out at our big thing in Arizona. You can come speak. We're going to show them video and everything." And I'm meeting all these young trans boys who are talking to me, and and this man comes up and introduces himself as the man who my mom interviewed. And I thought, wow, this guy thinks he's that guy, but there's no way that guy's alive. "Oh, it's nice to meet you, Steve." "Yeah." I thought he must be confused. I thought maybe he was interviewed by my mom, but that's not Steve Pieters. He's dead. Wouldn't be till about 4 years ago that I'm doing this podcast called Loosen the Bible Belt, and it's a comedy tour where I would preach, and then my lesbian friends who were not Christians would do comedy, and we would try to get Christians and people, and it was called Loosen the Bible Belt because we toured in the South, and we would go to the really deep, scary areas and be like, "Hey, we want," and it kind of worked, but we want to get Christians and gays together in the same room, and it kind of worked, except she had some really, really harsh jokes. But but we had this really amazing moment, and for those past 4 years, we haven't stopped talking, and we became very close friends, and then I've done so many funerals, and I've never been like this, okay? So this is just strange for me. I don't think I cried this much at my own mom's funeral because I was in such denial. And Steve became a father to me, and he became a grandfather to my children. And it's so hard to believe he's gone because I have a fairy garden in the middle of my house that he gave to my little girl. And we talked on June 5th on her birthday, and I said, "They're all making fairy wands," and here I tried to make this masculine fairy wand, and my little girl would not let me make a masculine fairy wand, and he loved it. And I have my little fairy wand, and it's very sparkly and beautiful, and it's really amazing. And he would send my kids gifts. And for Steve, I'm a very broken human being. Going through what I did with my family broke me. Then taking a stand and watching all the other remaining friends kind of go broke me. I'm an introverted pessimist. Steve is not an introverted pessimist. I was like the dark angel that flew in, and he kind of took under his wing. And we would have incredible talks, and I said, Steve, we got to get the conservatives, and we've got to get the conservatives, and we got to get the liberal folks to stop scapegoating each other, and we got to bring them back, and I have to start a reformation in the church. And everybody would laugh about that, except for Steve, and Steve was like, you're right. He believed in my call, even though I had like 10 people just watching me during COVID, because I had no church, because COVID got rid of that. But he was willing to share his darkness as well with me. And we could go to dark places together. And we were both in recovery, and we could talk about that. And when my co-pastor fell off the wagon and got on heroin again, Steve helped me with that. And then when we had to bury Caleb, Steve was there for me, because I was full of incredible guilt for letting my friend die. One of the funny things is and I found out from Timothy said, the problem with Steve is that he never asked for money or anything like that, and the one thing he did with me is he always pushed me to continue raising money for Revolution. So now every time I do the offering or whatever at the end of the Revolution service, I was, in honor of Steve Pieters, we are now going to in fundraising, because I'm a baker. Bakers, we don't have a good reputation for fundraising. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. So now I blame Steve. That's great. And it's funny, when I was doing this documentary I just finished doing a documentary with Vice about my mother, and Steve was a part of that. I'm really excited. We're also working on a documentary about Steve as well, and hopefully be out one of these days. I had to work with the Assemblies of God, the AG, the evangelicals, the denomination that my parents were in, and to get videos. And of course, when I called them, and I don't know why they had me call, like it's just like, these guys hate me. These guys think I'm crazy. I'm like, hey, it's Jamie Charles. Yep, that one. And they're like, yeah, we have all the tapes except for the one with the homosexual. And I said, oh, you mean Steve? Steve has been a surrogate father because my dad hasn't been around a lot. It's too bad you lost that. I don't think they lost it. Steve understood me, and that's why I'm celebrating Steve. A lot of people write me off because I can disappear. I can go into dark places and someone said, Jay, Steve said he was often worried about you. But he never let that on. He just always encouraged me through all the dark times. And we had great talks. We'd visit and we would talk about the Bible. And I remember one time we were talking about Galatians, and he goes, were the Gauls really like the Irish type Scottish area? Is that true about Galatians? And I said, well, I thought it was until you just asked me. So now I have to go check. I checked, and it was. I was right. And it was great to be right and talk to Steve about that. But it was, Steve mended my broken heart when I would go through breakups. We were able to talk about religion. We were able to talk about sex, heterosexual sex, gay sex, life, living life on life's terms, reconciliation, bringing people together, having hard conversations that we've got to have if we want to see the church survive, if we want to see something happen. And we talked about it, and he would call me, and he would encourage me and say, don't give up. And he would tell me things that my mom would say to him, or that he was listening to my mother's albums. And so I'm going to just read a few of his favorite verses that we shared together, and then I'm out of here. Not for good, just off the podium. I have a real dry sense of humor too, folks. And I like to sniff a lot. Therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have obtained access to this grace and the glory of God. And not only that, but we also boast in our suffering, And this was something that both me and Steve understood when he first started telling me he couldn't swallow. And we were having these talks. And I am a questioning pastor. So when he would say these things were happening, he would be like, I'm just praying that God will show up. And I'm like, I'm just damn mad at God that this is happening. It's like a yin and yang. I'm going to be like, I'm just so angry, Steve. I don't want you to go now. And not only that, but we can also boast in our suffering, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not disappoint us, because God has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that He has given to us. And that verse reminds me of Steve. Steve got all those things. If you realize it's a list of things, hope does not disappoint because God loves us. So when we suffer, it produces endurance. He had that endurance, and then endurance produces character, and he had that character. And he had that love for everyone. And he knew how to love people in their own way, as it's already been said. Him and my mother also shared a favorite verse that it says, "Who will separate us from the love of Christ? Will hardship or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? It is written, for your sake we are being killed all day long. We are counted as sheep to slaughter." That's a real uplifter. "No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor heights, nor depths, nor anything else in creation will be able to separate us from the love of Christ Jesus." And he believed that. I like the New Living Version because it says even the gates of hell will not prevail against us. Last one, yes, I'm a preacher. You got it. It was one that we also shared together. And I want you all to listen to this one. Come on, guys. Everybody, ladies, gentlemen, let's wake up. Wake up. I know it's hot in here. I know it's long, but I want you to hear this one. I want you to hear this one. I'm going to pull a Tammy Faye on you, and that's why I'm saying that. She would go down and, talk to people. I'm not going to do that. "For the whole law can be summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If, however, you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another." So remember, it's our job to love even those who don't love us. Even those who are hard to love, and we struggle to love, and we struggle to see. And I am so grateful for those years that Steve was in my life. I miss him so much. And I hope him and my mother are celebrating together in heaven. And I just want to say, Steve, I love you, buddy. I miss you. Life is really tough without you. And I'm gonna make it, and I'm gonna take a long time till I get there. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Oh, there we go. Now we'd like to invite up the Reverend Elder Jim Metolsky, pastor from the Congregational Church of the Peninsula UCC in Belmont, California, for the eulogy.
So if you know this chorus, sing it with me. I'll say the words. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. Just sing it once with me. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. We'll find a key. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. And I wanted to sing that because it's about showing up and about representation and about finding your story and being your story. And Steve represented all of those things. A proud, openly gay guy with HIV and many other identities too, living boldly in the light out in the world in a way that inspired change in the people who knew him his whole life long, and also who have known him over the last many years in Los Angeles and all the different ways that he participated in many communities. Steve was all about, this is our story, this is our song, and singing it proudly, bravely, out in the open. I know this is kind of a long service, and I'll say this, it's because Steve was a complicated person with many relationships, and this is a picture of who Steve was and is. It's a complicated, interesting picture, and it's still shorter than Oppenheimer, so. When I think about Steve, who it was my privilege to know for over 40 years, actually 45 years, I knew him, as we used to joke, before he became Steve Pieters. In this way, I knew him when we were both, before we had become ministers, preparing for ministry, and with great optimism and zeal for how we would change the world through the Metropolitan Community Church movement, the MCC movement. We had theories, we had ideas, if only people would listen to us. And I knew him then, and there were two things he longed for: to have an impact on the world through his ministry, and also to have kind of a Hollywood career. And it's true, he talked about those things even before all the things that we have celebrated today unfolded. He loved performing, he loved the theater, he loved the arts, and he loved church. All of those things. But here's the most important thing. He loved all of you who are here. He loved you. And what you thought mattered to him. And how you were present to him mattered to him, even when he couldn't remember how to express it. But Steve longed for these things. And who here isn't happy that he got to achieve both of them? Because he really did. Now, I know we're in the beginning of the Jewish holy days with Rosh Hashanah, but there's a word I learned from a different holy day, Passover. The word is dayenu. It means enough. And in this way, it would have been enough if the only thing that Steve ever accomplished was what happened through his appearance on the Tammy Faye show and the events that unfolded afterwards. Even in the first minute you see it, if you haven't watched it lately, watch it again. Tammy Faye leans over and says to him via camera, "How did you first know you were different?" And people got to hear for the first time in a widespread way, in a particular way, from a gay Christian minister, what it meant to be gay at the age of 3 and 7 and 9. And though this was an interview about AIDS and had a great deal of importance in that regard, it would have been enough if they just could have heard that one thing, because it turned the evangelical Christian world upside down, and it gave people an insight into what it meant, or what it means to be gay. In the 1960s, in the 1970s, in the 1980s, and even sometimes still today, just talking about the United States, it was inconceivable for a person to claim to be gay and open. It was illegal in many instances, and people paid lifetime consequences or paid with their lives for it. Steve, from the very beginning, was out. He believed in being who he was and being in the light, and he didn't know how to be closeted, and that was a gift he modeled for all of us. And that was the context into which he became a Metropolitan Community Church, MCC minister. Because in the 60s and 70s and 80s, gay people had separate churches if they wanted to be open about who they are. I want to commend in the department of saying so it doesn't go unsaid, thank you to Pastor Kathy and Hollywood Church, because most people who go to church tomorrow will be going to churches that condemn homosexuality and say it is incompatible with Christianity. Even the United Methodist Church still has that officially as a doctrine. This church breaks rules and welcomes people in the spirit of MCC. I think that we're cousins as churches. So thank you, Kathy, for being a rule breaker. Steve would get a kick out of that, being a rule breaker, even in his memorial service. But he was out and open, and that was part of who he was. And he approached HIV in the same way. I knew Steve before he was diagnosed. I knew Steve during the times of his early diagnoses when they were trying to discover what this was. It was never a question for him to try to conceal it or hide it. And even though it took a great deal from him, it also gave him life and purpose to be able to be out and open, to represent the out, proud person that he was, and I believe still is. This is one of Steve's gifts to us. Be out, be proud, be who you are, no matter what that is. And what is restored to you will be greater than what you might lose initially. Steve lived that way, and he loved that way. Now, Steve also was a person who represented Metropolitan Community Churches and people with HIV in a number of national and global contexts, in meetings of religious people and political people. But the difference is, in most of those meetings that were perhaps sympathetic to the poor person with HIV that we must pity, Steve was the person with HIV, telling his own story, representing himself and all of us at that time in those environments. It was a change in paradigm, not ministry to, but ministry by and with and from. His life in the open was a gift, both about being gay and about having HIV. And I want to say this about, I'm cutting my material, of course, but about Steve and the body. Steve loved his body. Some of us knew him during a phase when you didn't see him without a gym bag in one hand and a weight in the other. Because during a period of time when it was possible for him, he went to the gym religiously and developed his body and wasn't shy about showing it off. And that meant something to him and to all of us who at the time saw our bodies failing or were ashamed of them. Steve modeled something beautiful and shameless through his love of the body. Steve also believed in the resurrected body, that is, the body in the life to come. He authored a pamphlet on living spiritually with HIV that ended up being put in the hands of more people with HIV than probably any other piece of literature. And it was about the body and reclaiming the body and assurance that the body is eternal. I could quote some scriptures like my Assemblies of God friend Jay, but I went to a liberal seminary, so we didn't actually learn how to do that. We just have ideas. But Steve believed not only in the physical body and the goodness of the physical body, but he believed in the spiritual body as well. And you can read about his work on a website called California Revealed. I actually was part of having all of his papers and his fieldwork notes and his newsletters digitized and placed there. And there are 12 years worth of description of how he went around the country and around the globe speaking to grassroots people about what it means to love your body and to believe that your body is eternal. Go to California Revealed and put in Stephen Pieters, and you'll see pages and pages and pages of these notes that are a social history of the HIV movement in the 80s and 90s, as well as the religious HIV movement globally. There's a great interview I read just yesterday with Dr. Alexander Levine about people with HIV in Chile. He wrote about things and documented it that nobody else was writing about. So he believed in the body, the physical body, he believed in the spiritual body, but he also believed in the body politic, that it means something to be alive, to have the gift of life, and to not engage in resignation or to participate in systems of oppression. Steve was a liberationist, a liberation activist. And I don't want you to come and just celebrate Steve's life and think about all the lovely things that make us feel good and the ways that he made us feel good, but I also want you to remember Steve, the revolutionary activist, who wasn't afraid to speak up and call us to participate in the body politic. During COVID, he and I talked frequently about this one thing that was evolving in our country. Why didn't we learn from AIDS? Why didn't we learn? And there were two things that we talked about, not only during COVID, but then as other things evolved. One is this: gay men, we owe a debt of gratitude to the women in our lives. And the recent erosion of reproductive justice, reproductive choice, is something that we ought to all be outraged and engaged about. He remembered that it was Lucia and Nancy Radcliffe and a women's church in Los Angeles called De Colores and others who provided help to him. And that was emblematic of how lesbians and other women also stood up and were in solidarity with gay men during HIV and AIDS. And we talked about how gay men especially, but all of us, need to stand up right now and pay the debt, because what's happening around reproductive justice is reflective of the same prejudice that happened against people with HIV and AIDS and against gay people. So this is, for gay men especially, wake up. You want to remember Steve? Do something. Make a contribution to Planned Parenthood. Do something. And here's the other thing we talked explicitly and endlessly about. And I was actually looking at some interviews that we did together and with some others about during COVID, about what didn't we learn about AIDS? The scandal that in this country, healthcare continues to be a privilege and not a human right. Did we spend all those years fighting for justice and equality and medicine just so that we wouldn't end up with universal health care? It's a scandal. And if you want to remember Steve, say the words: universal health care. Health is a human right. And one of the best ways to remember Steve is by being the activist that we heard testified to earlier. This meant something important to him. Be an activist around health care and equal access to health care. I want to say one last thing. Steve had a gift for being loved. People just loved him. Sometimes it was easy to love him. Sometimes it was hard to love him. But I never regretted a moment's love I had for Steve. And I bet neither do any of you regret it. Love was at the heart of who he was, and he evoked it, and he gave it. Now, I'm a gay man. I went to a liberal seminary. I can't quote the Bible, but I can quote musicals. A bell's not a bell till you ring it. A song's not a song till you sing it. Love in your heart wasn't put there to stay. Love isn't love till you give it away. And Steve did give away everything he received in love. So I can quote the Bible. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it. Love is as strong as death. Steve believed that God was greater than AIDS, that love is greater than AIDS, that we are greater than AIDS. 80 million people have been infected with HIV and AIDS worldwide. 40 million are no longer alive. Only 3/4 of those people have access to protease and other medications at this moment, including people in our own country. Shouldn't matter what country they're in, but I'm just saying. If we want Steve to keep on going, not only in heaven, where think of the great reception he is still enjoying from all the people that he helped free from shame before they left this life and who he gave hope to. But if we want Steve to be stronger than death and stronger and like the love that never ends, let's engage in activities of social justice that are a testimony to his core beliefs. Let's give it away like love. And let's end with this. Say this chant with me 3 times. It's a little different from you might have learned it originally. Act up, fight back, end AIDS, because we can. And at Steve's funeral, I wanted to be sure we said this. So 3 times with me. Act up, fight back, end AIDS. Act up, fight back, end AIDS. Act up, fight back, end AIDS. Amen.
Steve's favorite song was I'm Still Here. I think it was the Elaine Stretch's, sorry for butchering that name, sorry Broadway Queens.
Well, you corrected me about the God is good thing, so.
My memorial will be next week. So I love that, thank you, Michael. But we're gonna invite up right up to the very last minute, Julian Armaya. Say that one more time. Oh, well, you are in for a treat. So we have the GMCLA coming up. One thing that came to my mind while the pastor was speaking about pride and being who you are. I don't know if you remember, but gay men used to identify themselves with earrings. And in the right ear, if you wore an earring, you were gay. It was a way of signaling that. Well, in middle school, I tried piercing my left ear because people knew that I was gay before I was willing to accept it. And one of my last moments with Steve, when I was helping him out at the house, he asked me, he said, when you're with family, do you wear your earrings? And I said, yes. And he said, good. But help us welcome the Gay Men's Chorus.
Yes, this is Timothy. While they're taking their place, and John West is playing the Wally Wally, Waters Wide on the organ, I want to point out these items here, the mandala, more or less, that are Steve Stoll's from his faith practice, from his work as a reverend, as a pastor, and Jay, where are you, Jay? This is the Bible your mother gave to Steve, that he used for his weddings. I guess he used it for Allison and Bob, and for Christie's, and you, yes. There are several, and they're all written in the front of that Bible, so that's something you should take with you when we exit. We only have the caterer for another 40 minutes. In the gym, which is behind us. Ushers will show you how to get there after your bathroom break. But look at this incredible group. The first time I saw them, I burst into tears when the curtain went up. There were 150 of them at the time. Ernest Harrison, conductor.
While my colleagues come forward, I'll begin the benediction, this blessing, a blessing. Beloved, receive the promise of Jesus. My peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you, peace not as the world gives. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. Let the blessing of the Holy One, Goddess, God, eternal Spirit, be here among us and well up within us. And Alex.
May he rest in peace. Angels of God, take him to the New Jerusalem, where he will be love eternal. May his light shine upon us. May he rest in peace.
On behalf of Founders Metropolitan Community Church and the Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches, we release the spirit of Steve Pieters and transfer his membership to the cloud of witnesses. Just remember, we'll meet just inside the eastern gate. Amen.
God is good. And all the time, God is good. We're going to invite Luis Ramirez to sing Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee.
Joyful, joyful, Lord, we adore thee. God of glory, Lord of love, hearts unfold like flowers before thee, open to the sun above. Melt the clouds of sin and sadness, drive the doubt of dark away. Giver of immortal gladness, fill us, Lord, fill us with the light of day. Joyful, joyful, we adore thee, God of glory, Lord of love, hearts unfold like flowers before thee, opening to the sun above. Melt the clouds of sin and sadness, drive the doubt of dark away. Giver of immortal gladness, fill us, Lord, fill us with the light of day.
Please join us for the reception. Thank you.